Now, here at home, the state capture inquiry has had evidence of alleged widespread corruption involving state officials and private business. Now, former liberation movements on our continent start with good intentions but end up struggling once in power. So we're asking this morning, why is it that they end up undermining the very ideals that they fought for? To help us unpack this, we're joined from our Cape Town studios by Council for the Advancement of South African Constitutions, Lawson Naidoo. That's KSEC. Mr. Naidoo, good morning, and thank you very much for joining us this morning. When one is watching what's been unfolding at the state capture inquiry, and there's many others that are currently happening. We've got the one that's looking into former NPA officials, the Mkhoro one. We've got one that's looking to the PIC, and all kinds of information coming out about bribery and corruption involving senior government officials, and many of whom were freedom fighters themselves. The question comes now to say, what really happens? Why do we see that people who were in the liberation movement, like the African National Congress, like Frelimo, for example, in the neighboring Mozambique, MPLA in Angola, I mean, the list goes on. Once they're in power, they seem to be battling with really pursuing those ideals of uplifting the people.
Good morning, Dan. Thank you very much. Yes, look, I think as you put it, one of the fundamental parts of the problem is that once in power, there is a repudiation of the ideals of the liberation movement. Liberation movements and liberation struggles that were premised on respect for human rights and human dignity, premised on trying to achieve a more equal society across the continent amongst all the liberation movements. But, that has to be juxtaposed against the colonial and apartheid histories that we come from. And those societies that were spawned by colonialism and apartheid were essentially morally corrupt and corrupt in many, many other ways. And unfortunately, what has happened is that we haven't dismantled the edifice of that colonialism and apartheid. We've taken over parts of the system that was there already. And, as we took power, people that were in the liberation movements saw opportunities for self-enrichment and took advantage of those opportunities. And I think that's part of the dilemma that we're facing at the moment. What do we do to try and reinforce the ideals that the liberation struggles and that the demands of people in our countries today still have as their priorities, because the lives of ordinary people has failed to significantly improve, certainly in South Africa, in the 25 years of our democracy.
I mean, you look at Mozambique, for example. I'm just going to use an example. I mean, I lived there when I was in exile for 12 years in the 80s, and you look at what Frelimo was espousing, and you hear stories today of the former finance minister, Manuel Chang, who's currently been detained here in South Africa, pending extradition to the United States. Him and other people around him getting a loan of about $2 billion on behalf of the Mozambican state for the people, but the money ends up in their pockets.
Look, Dan, there's a quote I want to read, which was delivered by former President Nelson Mandela during his last State of the Nation address almost 20 years ago, on the 5th of February 1999. And he said in this speech, "Our hope for the future depends also on our resolution as a nation in dealing with the scourge of corruption. Success will require an acceptance that, in many respects, we are a sick society. It is perfectly correct to assert that all this was spawned by apartheid. No amount of self-induced amnesia will change this reality of history." And he goes on to say that unless we take action, we're not going to rid ourselves of the scourge. And I think we failed to take adequate action. We've made commitments as a democratic society to put in place anti-corruption legislation. We've signed international agreements, but we failed to really deal with the issue at an operational level. People will point to the demise of the Scorpions and so on. But this is something that, goes back to the 1990s and the immediate aftermath of liberation. We can go back and look at the corruption that occurred during the arms deal. I mean, the testimony that we're hearing from Mr. Greasy at the Zondo Commission now is not very different from the kind of relationship that there was between Glenn Agliotti and the former National Police Commissioner, Jackie Salibi. So these are patterns of behavior that repeat themselves and have been allowed to repeat themselves, which mean that as a society we're not taking corruption as seriously as we should. And we certainly, we pay lip service to the ideals of the Freedom Charter, and politicians, talk about the Freedom Charter when it's convenient to do so. But the underlying philosophy of the Freedom Charter is something that we don't practice in our daily lives.
Well, South Africa, therefore, is not an exception. I've mentioned Mozambique. I mean, you look at MPLA in Angola, the daughter of José Eduardo dos Santos, the former president as well, and now the current government trying to recoup some of the monies that were allegedly stolen by that government, that administration, and José Eduardo dos Santos' daughter becoming one of the richest women in Africa on the back of a state that is a developmental state. You mentioned the word behavior. Is it behavior? Because as human beings, we are susceptible to greed. When we get into power, we then see opportunities to enrich ourselves. Or is it behavior because we lack the will, the political will, to pursue very strongly those ideals, Lawson?
Dan, I think it's both of those issues. It's innate greed is certainly part of it, and I think that's what former President Mandela's quote that I read out just now speaks to. But it's also a failure of political will to deal with it. When you have a scandal like we had in South Africa just a few years ago, the Nkandla scandal, and Parliament as an institution and the ANC with its vast majority in Parliament turns a blind eye to corruption on that scale. And then what kind of society have we become? You speak to MPs individually and privately, and they're embarrassed by what they were forced to do, because they were forced to condone that theft from the public purse. And when things like that happen and Parliament fails to take action, when institutions that we have in our Constitution fail to take action, then this becomes something that becomes seen as the norm. In many respects, in many ways, that in certain parts of the country, we see violence, particularly in KwaZulu-Natal, as becoming part of a daily norm. And we speak about Black Lives Matter, again, when it suits us. But when killings happen on a regular basis, as a society, we turn a blind eye to that. And we really have to ask ourselves, what kind of society have we become? And we can talk about the legacy of apartheid and colonialism, as I started out doing, and we cannot ignore that. Because let us not forget that in many post-colonial societies, the former colonizing powers exploited opportunities for bribery and corruption because they were very keen to maintain their economic stranglehold over post-colonial societies. Up until quite recently, many European countries used to give, for example, a tax benefit for paying facilitation fees for transactions, things that you and I would call a bribe. So, I think the Western world and the former colonial powers can't escape criticism in this. But I think fundamentally we, as the beneficiaries of the struggles for freedom and democracy, need to take the primary responsibility and say this kind of behavior cannot be tolerated.
Now, Lawson, very briefly, we're running out of time now. You spent many years yourself in exile during the struggle days against apartheid. You are now in that council advancing our constitution, which has been billed as one of the best constitutions in the world. We're having an election coming up here, 25 years after democracy. Are you hopeful about the future? Very briefly.
Well, I think we have to be hopeful. I think the Constitution provides us with the framework to create the kind of society that respects human rights and human dignity, advances the quality of life of ordinary people. But I think we have failed over the last 25 years to give real meaning and content to what's in that Constitution, to put in place the legislation and the policies, and to ensure that there's implementation of those promises that are there. And I think that's the challenge that is going to come for the new parliament that is going to be elected in the elections later this year, and for the new government that will be in place. We really need to put the principles of our Constitution as a priority and focus as a national effort on achieving what that Constitution demands that we do.
Thank you very much, Lawson Naidoo, from the Council for the Advancement of the South African